what if the police could predict a crime before it even happened? I know, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right? Like Minority Report. But here's the thing. It's not science fiction anymore. It's happening right now. Law enforcement agencies are using algorithms to try and get ahead of criminal activity. But that raises a huge, huge question. Can a piece of code actually deliver justice, or are we just building a high-tech version of old prejudices?
Now, that quote, that's not from a movie script. Those are the words that were said to Robert McDaniel, a resident on Chicago's West Side, when police officers showed up and knocked on his door. He wasn't being arrested, he hadn't done anything wrong. But an algorithm, a piece of software, had put his name on a list of people it predicted were threats. And his story? Well, that's where our deep dive into predictive policing really begins.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll start with that knock on the door to see the real human impact. Then, we'll get into what this pre-crime tech actually promises. Next, and this is crucial, we'll look at the engine of bias, how these systems can go wrong. We'll examine a real-world algorithm called Compass, dig into the constitutional challenges, and finally, we'll talk about where we go from here. All right, let's start right there with that knock at the door. Because before we get into any of the data, the code, or the policy, you have to understand that these algorithms have very real, sometimes life-altering consequences for actual people. Okay, so let's really unpack the disconnect in Robert McDaniel's story. He's put on Chicago's strategic subject list, and police tell him that a computer model has calculated that he's a high risk for future violence. But here's the thing. His criminal record was basically non-existent, a single misdemeanor from years back. So why was he flagged? Well, the police commander suggested it might be because his best friend had been shot and killed a year earlier. Think about that. The algorithm wasn't just looking at him, it was judging him by his social network. His proximity to violence, even as a potential victim or just a grieving friend, was enough to put him on a police list as a future bad guy. McDaniel's story is just one really stark example of this technology in action. So let's zoom out a bit and ask, what is predictive policing really? And what's the big idea behind it? At its heart, this is what we're talking about. It's about feeding massive amounts of data into a computer and using statistical analysis to try and forecast crime. The promise, the sales pitch, is all about efficiency. It's a way to be proactive, to send police where they're needed before a crime happens, instead of just reacting after the fact. And this usually comes in two main flavors. First, you've got place-based policing. This is all about geography. The algorithm chews on historical crime data and spits out a map with hotspots, areas where crime is supposedly most likely to pop up next. Police are then sent to patrol those specific blocks. The second approach is person-based, and that's exactly what happened to Robert McDaniel. This type creates heat lists of individuals who the algorithm decides are likely to be involved in a crime, either as the person committing it or sometimes as the victim. So it all sounds very neat and scientific, but this is where that promise of pure data-driven objectivity really starts to crumble. Because these algorithms, they're only as good or as bad as the data we feed them. And the biggest critique is that the data we're using is historically and deeply flawed. And that brings us to this huge issue called the black box problem. See, a lot of these tools are built by private companies and they guard their code like a secret recipe. It's a trade secret. This means that the police departments using the software, the judges relying on it, and you, the public, have no idea how it's actually making its decisions. It's just a black box. A score comes out, but you can't see the work. And that makes it almost impossible to challenge a prediction or hold the system accountable when it gets things wrong. This quote right here just hits the nail on the head. It's the core of the problem. If the historical data you pour into the machine is already full of human bias, then the machine is going to learn that bias. It's going to automate it. It's going to amplify it. It is the classic computer science principle: garbage in, garbage out. And this isn't some new issue that just popped up with computers. The data being used today is the result of a very long history. We're talking about roots going back to slave patrols in the 1700s, some of the very first policing systems in America. Then in the early 20th century, the so-called father of modern policing, August Vollmer, talked about policing as a war against society's enemies, a group that he said included immigrants and Black people. And by the 1920s, you could already see clear patterns of disproportionate arrests in cities like Philadelphia. All of this history, every stop, every arrest, it creates what experts call dirty data. And that is the very foundation being used to build our supposedly objective 21st century algorithms.
And if you think this is all just ancient history, well, think again. Just look at New York City's stop and frisk policy. Between 2004 and 2012, police made 4.4 million stops. An absolutely staggering 80% of those stops were of Black and Hispanic people. This is a perfect example of how modern data collection can reflect disproportionate policing, and it's exactly the kind of data that would train an algorithm to see minority communities as bigger risks. Okay, so we've talked about the theory of bias. Now let's make it way more concrete. Let's look at probably the most famous and the most scrutinized predictive algorithm out there, a tool called Compass. So what is Compass? Well, it's software used in courtrooms all across the country, and its job is to predict how likely a defendant is to commit another crime. Judges use these risk scores to help them make huge decisions about bail and even sentencing. The goal, of course, is to have an objective tool to measure the risk of reoffending. But the big question became, how objective is it really? In 2016, the news outlet ProPublica dropped a bombshell investigation into Compass, and what they found was stunning. The algorithm was often wrong, but it was wrong in very different ways for Black and white defendants. Take a look at these numbers. They found that Black defendants who did not go on to commit another crime were wrongly flagged as high risk almost 45% of the time. For white defendants in the exact same situation, that number was just over 23%. Black people were nearly twice as likely to be incorrectly labeled a future criminal by the algorithm. As you can imagine, this kicked off a huge debate. ProPublica said, look, this difference in false positives is clear proof of racial bias. But North Point, the company that makes Compass, they fired back. They argued that if you look at overall accuracy, the algorithm is calibrated to be fair to both groups, and that ProPublica was looking at the wrong metric. This whole fight really highlights how tricky it is to even define fairness for an algorithm. What's more important, that the tool has the same overall accuracy rate for everyone, or that it doesn't make the same kind of devastating mistake disproportionately against one group of people? So we're not just talking about some academic debate about statistics. The use of these tools in the real world runs right up against fundamental questions about our constitutional rights. For starters, you've got the Fourth Amendment. Police need reasonable suspicion to stop someone. But is a computer's probability score enough to count as reasonable suspicion? Then there's due process. If a secret black box algorithm determines your fate and you're not allowed to see how it works or challenge its logic, have you really been given a fair process? And maybe the most dangerous part is what's called the feedback loop of injustice. If biased data tells police to go to a certain neighborhood, they'll make more arrests there. That new arrest data then gets fed back into the system, which proves the neighborhood is a hotspot, which leads to even more policing. It's a snake eating its own tail, a self-fulfilling prophecy powered by data. A whole coalition of civil rights groups, including the ACLU, put it this way. They argue that these tools don't actually fix biased policing, they just wrap it in a shiny, high-tech package. They provide what they call a misleading and undeserved imprimatur of impartiality, which is a fancy way of saying they stamp a seal of scientific objectivity on a system that might be fundamentally unfair. Okay, so this all sounds pretty grim. Given all these deep, complicated problems, where do we possibly go from here? Is the only answer to just throw this technology in the trash? Or are there ways to make it better and more accountable? Well, experts and advocates have laid out a pretty clear path forward. Step 1, mandate transparency. No more black boxes. We need to be able to see how these algorithms work. Step 2, empower the community. Decisions about using these powerful tools shouldn't be made behind closed doors. The people who will be affected by them need to have a voice. And step 3, conduct regular, independent audits to check for bias, and then make those results public for everyone to see. And this all points to a really fascinating alternative. Maybe the argument isn't that data is bad, but that we're just using it for the wrong things. Instead of trying to predict citizen crime, what if we use data to identify police officers who are at risk of misconduct so we can get them better training and support? Or instead of sending more police cars to a hotspot, what if that data triggered more social services, like job programs or mental health resources, to address the root causes of what's going on in that neighborhood? And that really leaves us with the ultimate question. As we stand at this crossroads, we have this incredibly powerful technology that is changing law enforcement as we speak. But as we move into that future, we have to ask ourselves a very serious question. Can you really code fairness? Can you program justice? Or does true justice require something more? Something human, like empathy, context, and mercy. Things an algorithm might never understand. The answer to that is going to define what justice looks like for all of us in the digital age.